Well, good evening and welcome to all of you. My name is Pastor David Stairs, and I'm the pastor of the Reformed Church of Masterton, here that meets in this building. And welcome to our event tonight. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping points. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this building, the toilets are just down the hall here. The ladies is on the left and the men's is on the right. Fire exits, there's the one behind you, there's one over here, and there's also one behind the screen here, so in case of emergency. Tonight we're going to have about a 2-hour section to spend together, and we'll go for about 45, 50 minutes, and then take a break, and then go for another 45 or 50 minutes after that. And you'll notice there's also books here at the front that you can take a look at in the breaks or afterwards. So now it's my special pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Whether you are Tangata Whenua, or the descendant of immigrants, or whether you're an immigrant yourself, we all share a common present here in New Zealand. And it's a present that arises out of history. No matter who you are, a robust understanding of our common past as New Zealanders can help us understand and engage with our present and help us chart a course for the future. To guide us in this tonight is our speaker. He is a writer, a poet, and a historian, and is passionate about bringing a balance to New Zealand's early history by setting aside politics and agendas. He's an award-winning journalist and an author who has written a number of books, including Ratana the Prophet, Connecting the Clouds, The History of the Internet in New Zealand, Bible and Treaty, Missionaries Among the Maori, and Beyond Betrayal, Trouble in the Promised Land. He is a passionate advocate for the Bible and the Treaty of Waitangi, the two founding documents that he believes should continue to be viewed in tandem for the outworking of a brighter, more just, and balanced future for Aotearoa, New Zealand. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Keith Newman.
Kia ora tātou. Aroha nui ki te tangata. Blessings to the people. Aroha nui ki te matua tama wairua tapu, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Kia tau rangi Māori. Blessings, peace be with you this evening. It's great to be with you, and we'll probably ramble across a lot of territory tonight. You know, we're in interesting times in history. I've never lived in such a time as the times that we live in right now. There's just so much going on, so many challenges that we all face in our day-to-day living with COVID and with just so much shifting and changing. It's often difficult to find your tūranga waiwai, your place to stand where you can be confident about what the future might hold for you. There's just so much doubt and uncertainty, and in this time of change, it's almost like we're regathering. We've got a time to think about where we've been and what's important for where we might go to. And, so often I think that we have failed to understand as a small country at the edge of the Pacific, way down here where the sun first rises, furthest nation from Jerusalem, our own history. We have a huge heritage in this country, and sometimes I think there's a dimension missing that if we don't get a hold of, then the risk is that it's all about politics, it's about warfare, and it's about things that make us feel uncomfortable. But I think that there's a thread that runs through our history that if we can tune into it, it helps us to make sense of what has happened in the past and what might happen in the future and our responsibilities for now. You know, there's a kind of parable that I like to talk about a lot, and it's the idea of looking backwards in order to understand the future. Now that's a Maori proverb and often used, but it's also a proverb a lot of Indigenous people use when they try to understand or position themselves in history. In other words, the Western way of looking at things sometimes traps us. We think about things in a spreadsheet term. We think about things literally and in a line, rather than going, hang on a minute, there's some poetry that we're missing out on. There are other ways to see history. And if you look at the Bible, for example, and you look at the Hebrew language, you realize that's an indigenous language. And if you consider the whakatauki or the proverbs that are used there, you don't just read them in a line and go, oh yeah, that's interesting. They're actually meant to make you stop and think and consider, what else could this mean? What's the background to this? What's the story behind this? What does this mean to me now? So these kind of whakatauki or proverbs or ways or poetic ways of looking at things are designed to open us up and give us a fresh way of looking at our lives, of looking at the physical and the spiritual. And I think that one of the things that we fail to do is to have a much more holistic view of the world in which we live, which includes the movement of the stars, the flowing of the rivers, the environment in which we live, the faith that we have, the politics that we're involved in. It's all involved together. And when we start to compartmentalize, I think we start to lose the picture. Now, I just want to give you a warning this evening, because I looked in my bag a little bit earlier and I thought, oh, there's that throat spray that I used to use before I come out and speak, because sometimes, my throat gets a little bit dry, and I reached in and I grabbed it and I went spray, spray, spray. And I thought, that tastes a bit strange. I wonder if it's off. And then I looked at the bottle and it said lens cleaner. So if I get a bit squeaky this evening, you'll know what went on. And I just clean my glasses. But sometimes we need our lens cleaning, don't we? There's a bit of dirt that gathers on my glasses anyway. And I think, I see life through. And I go, yeah, you need to clean your glasses. And I think sometimes in history and understanding where we're at, we need to stop and clean our lenses and take a fresh look at things. I really like the idea that that we're connected to everything. And, we've got, I think we're moving into an era called, we get a holiday next year called Matariki. And I think the Maori understanding is far better than our perceptions of, I get annoyed at Christmas when we sing White Christmas. Jingle bells, jingle bells. I get annoyed. That's not us. That's another part of the world that's been imported, and we sing those songs, and just something inside of me cringes. Where are our songs? And I think one of the things that we've got to start refocusing on is, where are we in the world? We're in the Pacific. We're a Pacific Island nation. We have Pacific Island neighbours. We have much more in common with what's going on in the immediate Pacific than we do in Europe. And yet so much of our news comes from Europe. And I keep saying, we're not Aotearoa. This is Aotearoa, the land of the long white or bright cloud. We just import too much from other histories that don't relate to us when we don't even fully understand our own history. And I like the idea of Matariki. In the Bible it's called the Seven Sisters or the Pleiades, and that suits this part of the world, because it's about time to plant certain crops. It's time to say farewell to the people who've passed on, who contributed to our family life or our historical life over the past year. There's some sense in there. There's some magic about there. There's something that comes alive about the idea of a fresh start each year. The Maori New Year seems to be far better positioned for us in Aotearoa than some of the things that we've taken on board. And there are some things that we should know, and how Christianity came to Aotearoa in 1814. We should know those stories. What happened back then. We should know that there were 26 years of strong Maori and missionary relationships in Aotearoa before the Treaty of Waitangi came. We should know that Edward Gibbon Wakefield and the New Zealand Company and Barney Rhodes, who, I come from... I've just come up from Hawke's Bay, from Ngāti Kahungunu territory. I live right out in Homoana that looks at Te Matawa Maui, Cape Kidnappers, and there was a guy who came along there in 1839, just before the treaty was signed, and he was involved in whaling operations, and he thought, well, I'd like to have all of the territory here. I'm an opportunist. I like to make money. I like to buy things real cheap, and later on I can sell them for a profit, which is pretty much what Edward Gibbon Wakefield and the New Zealand Company did when they came out here, and they'd been told not to come out because Britain had enough colonies of its own, and this was a private enterprise. So private enterprises were coming here looking to acquire land from people who didn't understand what was going on and had no right to sell it anyway. And William Barney Rhodes came out and he thought, ooh, I think I'll have all the land from Mahia all the way down to Wairarapa. Well, you got another thing coming, because the Maori that were up in Nukutaurua at the time, because of the land wars, because of the musket wars, were informing William Williams, the missionary up there, of what was going on, and he said, no way. So there was a kickback, and he never got the land. He did get a small part of the land, including where I live at the moment, but that's how history plays out. So we need to know why and how the Treaty of Waitangi came about. We need to know the betrayal of Maori and missionaries by the Crown and the various investors who thought that they would have a part in this enterprise, the devastating impact of the land wars on Maori, the failure of the church to recognise its role as a treaty partner, and the focus of Jesus Christ on justice, mercy, love of the poor and dispossessed. We're meant to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And I just want to say, are we having the right conversations? So perhaps tonight we can start to have some of those conversations. So let's see what we've got here. That Indigenous way of viewing things, our way of unfolding the history. The ihu, I'm impressed, or I just think it's an incredible idea that ihu is nose. It also is the prow on a waka. It is what leads the way through the waves. And we call Jesus Christ ihu karaiti, Jesus the Christ, raiti, the light. There's something in that. And Titao Ihu, the prow, Ihu, the nose. The 8 tribes down on the South Island have called themselves that. There's something wonderful in all of this symbolism, if we begin to unpack it, about Aotearoa and the naming of the land, and even the naming of Ihu Karaiti, Jesus the Christ. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, shalom, peace, health, and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. And the word there in the Hebrew is ahirit, which is very similar to that Maori whakatauki, looking back for what comes after. This is a wonderful way to view history. And if we can look back to see where we've been, and we can begin to make peace with what's happened, and to deal with the issues that have happened in the past honestly and openly, then we can have a future. But sometimes if we don't look what's under the carpet and go, who put that underneath there? Oh, my ancestors never dealt with that, and they're leaving it for my generation to deal with. I think there's a younger generation that I see represented here. They don't want to have to deal with that. They want to get on with an amazing future, and it's up to us to lift that carpet and say, oops, there's some stuff here that we've closed our eyes to. We haven't been looking under the carpet. We haven't been honest. We haven't been facing up to what has gone on. So, I'm sure I did more than 2 slides. There we go. I think that this is incredible. You know, just recently we've come to an understanding that the fish, that is Te Ika a Maui and Te Waipunamu, which is the vessel or the waka of Maui, and this is metaphorical language. I heard somebody say the other day, oh, you Maori think that the North Island was fished up out of the South Island, and the Maori guy said, you guys think that the cow jumped over the moon. Well, we've got to get a bit more mature in our understanding of metaphorical language. There's a beautiful language here, and hopefully we'll unpack some of this. But I think that it's almost prophetic to see that this land that's called Zealandia, that they've confirmed exists. Look, we're sitting right on top of that. See that white part there stretches all the way to the coast of Queensland on the outside of Australia and a good part of the Pacific. So under the ground. And often that's where great truth, isn't it? We see things on the surface, see the fish on the surface, but we don't see what it's swimming in. So we're part of a continent. And who knew that? So we're important. We're one of the continents of the world. And yet on this fish, we have an opportunity to make a difference. We're such a small nation at the edge of the world. The chance is, if we get things right in Aotearoa, something will shine from this part of the world, this furthest part of the world where the sun first rises. Maybe we've got something. Maybe we've got a gift for the world. Can we get it? Can we understand our history? Can we feel proud about who we are? Can we deal with the stuff that we need to deal with? Because I do not want us to be like Europe, 1,000 years later, still squabbling. We can do this, hey? So this is part of telling our history. If you pulled the plug on the world's oceans, Zealandia will be revealed. So to the ends of the earth, the gospel was preached. That's us, apparently. So time to give something back, maybe. So let's roll the sleeves up a bit here and start to talk about some of this history, and we'll try and get through it as interestingly as possible, because I don't want to bore you, because when I was at school, I found that history was boring. And I think it was partly because it didn't affect me. It was always, history was something that happened to somebody else, somewhere else. It never happened to me. So put ourselves in the picture. We're making history tonight because we're here together. This will never happen again. All of us together. That means something. That's symbolic of something, that we gather together and we learn something and we share something of each other and we have a kai together afterwards, and maybe you buy some of my books, maybe you don't, but something changes because we get together. And it's a good thing to get together, isn't it? It's a great thing. So 1794, Samuel Marsden was made the New South Wales chaplain and magistrate. That's two jobs that he probably shouldn't have had. One of those jobs he probably shouldn't have had. A bit of a conflict there. He's the chaplain one day running a church service, and the next day he's got to be out there, as the Australians call him, being the flogging parson. And they hate him over there. There's a different perception of Marsden here, and maybe we can get some of that. But I find it really interesting, and you may see a golden thread come up on the side of some of my slides, because I think that there's a golden thread that runs through our history if we can find it. It's where things connect across generations or across whānau or families, and you go, wow, I never knew that. So, William Wilberforce, who knows what he's famous for? Ending slavery. He spent his life. I mean, William Wilberforce was one of those guys who was a privileged member of the British Parliament, the youngest member of the British Parliament, a good mate with the Prime Minister. They used to go to parties together. They were part of the social set, but he was a Christian and he had a conscience, and he thought, there's got to be more to this than I'm aware of. I'm having a good time here, but there's troubles in the world. I think I ought to quit Parliament. So he went to talk to his mate, who was the head of a church there, and his name was, who's the guy that wrote Amazing Grace? What's his name? John Newton. Absolutely, a former slave ship captain who had been part of the problem, but had had a conviction in his heart, and he wrote that song, Amazing Grace, that we still sing today, which is actually based on the rhythms that just broke his heart of what he realized. These are God's people, and I'm part of a trade that is enslaving people from another part of the world to make a fortune for people in a different part of the world. He repented and he became a pastor of a church, and well respected in the middle of London. And William Wilberforce went to see him and said, listen, I think I need to quit my job in Parliament because I don't feel it's God-honouring. I don't feel I'm making a difference. And he said, you stay right where you are, because you can make a difference there, and encouraged him to stay in Parliament. And from that moment, he began to use his membership of a group of Christians called the Clapham sect that changed the British history. They stopped the child labour down the mines, and they campaigned on so many issues, including better conditions for prostitutes and the poor in a changing world, including the end of slavery. He spent his life against the opposition of many of those people in the British Parliament who had made their money off the backs of the slave trade. He was not a popular person, but in the end, we have a lot to thank him for. And he was a mentor of Samuel Marsden, who was part of that humanitarian Christian group who began to make changes all around the world. So he was carrying that DNA, including because so many Maori were exploring, were adventurous, who went to New South Wales, and Marsden noticed that they were bedraggled, they'd been treated badly, they weren't getting paid the same as the other crew on the ships, and he began to campaign for equal pay for Pacific Islanders and Maoris. So already Samuel Marsden, while he's in New South Wales, is on a humanitarian Christian crusade for equal rights. Because I think underneath it all, if we're all children of the Most High God, then how dare we look at each other as if anybody is inferior or less deserving of God's grace and mercy and beauty. How dare? It's really a revelation, isn't it? How dare we be racist? How dare we treat others differently? And I think we're at a time where some of the ways that we've treated each other are now looking back at us from the mirror of society and forcing us to go, oops, I better be careful about the kind of jokes that I tell to people in the office or in the smoko room or at parties. I'd better start watching my language, because that exposes my inner attitude, my inner heart attitude. So Marsden was hosting up to 30 Māori at a time at his farms in Parramatta and in New South Wales, and teaching them various trades and giving them trees to take back home. And among them was Ngāpuhi chief Te Pāhi, who sent his sons once he'd heard from the wonderful things that were going on there, and Te Pāhi's nephew Ruatara. This is going back to 1805. Now these golden threads start to come together in an amazing way, because there's an unfortunate story with Te Pāhi, otherwise we might have got the missionaries here a lot earlier. But Te Pāhi got mistaken. Some whalers accused him of the burning of the Boyd, and there was a burning down of his village. Te Pāhi lost his life, and Marsden had to come out to Aotearoa when he finally got the chance to come out through the invitation of Ruatara, who he met on the slave ship, not on the slave ship, on the prison ship Anne in 1809 in London. And there's Ruatara bedraggled in a sealskin coat near the point of death. This guy had had adventures all around the place. He had wanted to see the world. So Marsden and his wife nursed Ruatara back to life and took him back to their farm, and then eventually he came back and he said, we want you to come out and teach the children, as Te Pāhi had before. So it was at the invitation of Māori that Marsden and the missionaries eventually came later on to teach the children. So 1814, 25th of December, we should know all about this, the good news, Te Rongapai at Rangihaua, the place of the new dawn. This is already starting to, this metaphorical language, Māori name places to have meaning. There's a reason for this. And as we watch all of these things line up, we go, whoa, okay. And the angel said to them, fear not, for behold, I bring you glad tidings of great joy, which will be to all people. That's from obviously Luke, and that was Marsden's first sermon. And Ruatara's response with 300 of his warriors is Te Hare o Ngāpuhi, or the dance of joy. And I love this. Everything is shifting and moving. See the calm of Waitangi spread out like the young shining cuckoo. I can't remember the word otherwise because I don't want to get it wrong, but the shining cuckoo comes every year in October, and it's a phenomena. This is like this bird suddenly arrives and it signals the beginning of a new season. This is the beginning of spring. Lay down peace. Let good be established. Make room for something new. I reckon that if Ruatara was with us today and he said that, it would mean something entirely different. I think we're at a time right now where we need to make room for something new. It says step to the left, step to the right, step back, something's coming, make room for something new. Something's happening, something's shifting, even in our time today. But then this perceptive response from Ruatara at that time, suggesting that the missionaries were bringing something for Māori that was important. And of course, Toiroa, who was the matakiti up at Nukutarua, even before Cook came, he had a prophecy. And Māori are often a very perceptive and prophetic people. And Toiroa said there's a new God coming. There's a new God coming. He's coming for Māori. He's a God whose son will be sacrificed, but still Māori will be oppressed. And that was only one of the things he said. He had whole pictures of sailboats and people with pipes and technology that nobody had heard of, trousers. It's an incredible story. Even before Cook came, there was a prophecy that things were changing. So here we are, 200 or so years later. So the mana of Marsden's message is still with us. But look at this, 1907, the first Marsden cross was erected at Uihi Bay, but it was damaged by a storm in 1918. A big storm came up. Well, the world was in the middle of a big storm, and this was the ending of a big storm, wasn't it? 1418, the First World War. Is that symbolic? I don't know. Maybe it was. Big storm blows up Marsden's cross, tips it over, bits are broken, and in 1922, Tauputiki Wirimurātana, who I'm going to tell you a bit more about tonight, he'd had a great vision about uniting the people and about moving away from the old gods and superstitions, and for the Maori people at a critical time in their history to get a vision, to get hope back together again, because they were a broken people. The promises of the treaty had not been honoured, and it took a great leader, and he was a reluctant prophet, and he stepped into that place between the two world wars and gave hope. But there he was in 1922 on his northern tour to the Bay of Islands, and he's there at the place where the Marsden Cross is, and he's going there to claim the Maori, or to claim the mana of Marsden's gospel message. And he's there in front of it, and it's broken, and he goes and he looks down and he says, "Hang on a minute, boys, something here." Picks it up, and it's a big chunk of the Marsden cross, and he says, "All right, boys, let's take this back to Ratanapa." So they put it on the train, and they took it back there, and that is now concreted into the Arepa Tower at the entrance of the Ratana Temple. So, golden connection, beautiful link, cheeky blighter, grabs hold of a bit of the cross, it's right there. This is important. But now that Marsden Cross is now at, where is it? It's at, did I say that? Where it is now? I didn't say where it is. Where is it? It's there somewhere. But anyway, wherever it is, wherever it is, before Marsden actually preached his first gospel message, I told you about Te Pahi and the misunderstanding, and there was tension, and there was war going to be, Matauri Bay, that's right. There was tension there, and that before he even gave that December the 25th sermon, Marsden turned up there. He wanted to know what had gone on. He'd heard all the rumours. They were mocking him back in Sydney and saying, Te Pahi, that guy that you called your friend who went and stayed with the governor for a month, and the governor gave him a prefabricated house, and he took it back to his island and actually had minted a medal to commemorate the relationships between Māori and Pākehā. And it was brilliant. But now we've got these whalers have mistaken things. They've created a chaos, and now there's war about to break out. Marsden went to Matauri Bay and stayed overnight and talked to everybody, got a better understanding of what was going on, absolved Te Pahi from being involved in that crime, and caused forgiveness with the two parties now agreeing. So Marsden's involved in brokering forgiveness between warring tribes before he even preaches his 25th service. It's incredible. I love it. So that cross is an incredible thing. But when the missionaries come here, they're in the middle of chaos. They're in the middle of the musket wars. There are intertribal and interhapu issues that are now being resolved in different ways than they ever were before because muskets have been made available to Māori. And it's kind of a civil war. And I have to say, unfortunately, that Kendall was involved in ensuring that 300 or so of those muskets came to Aotearoa through his agency. And they were using muskets to trade in order to be able to have funding enough and food enough to survive. But he didn't see the bigger picture. And while we had Hongi Hika going to England to help translate, Hongi Hika was looking at the kings. He got invited to the Royal Armoury, and he's going, Oh, okay. So he got given some treasures, which he pretty quickly cashed in and turned them into muskets and brought them home and accelerated what became the musket wars, which actually changed the whole terrain of what was going on in Aotearoa at the time. People were dispersed across the country. They were moved from their territories from about 1810 to the late 1830s. It was a dangerous place, Aotearoa, and you would not want to be a Pākehā wandering around without protection, so the missionaries mainly stayed in the far north. Hongi Hika, Te Raupraha from Kawhia, Te Whirowhiro and Te Waharoa from Waikato, Te Hiuhiu from Taupo, and other chiefs were displacing other tribes, including in Wairarapa, where they were challenging Ngāti Kahungunu and Rangatani. So a chaotic place, a scary place, and it took quite a while for the Wesleyans to come. They came in 1819, but 1827, Ruatara's died. The missionaries are now under the watchful eye of Hongi Hika, who sees them as a way to achieve trade, etc. They haven't got the same care that they had before, and by 1827, the Wesleydale mission is burned down in the midst of all of this. And it took a decade for any Māori to accept the gospel, because Māori don't accept things easily. They listened, they watched, they waited, they observed behaviour, and probably took on far more than what was understood at the time. But there was no official kind of, you've got to know your catechism, you've got to know all of this and be able to recite back to me and whatever. And the reality is that a lot of that teaching was done in Te Reo. It was done in Māori. People go, oh no, trying to teach them English. No, the missionaries had to stop and learn the language and the customs and the ways of Māori before they could even communicate any of this, and most of it was done in Te Reo. The first churches in Aotearoa were Māori churches. You've got to understand that. So while the missionaries are going, we're not having much success here, and people are wanting to pull the plug on their finances, actually Māori were having a lot of conversations behind the scenes and perhaps going, is this the God that Tuiroa was telling us about? Yeah, there's something about that. You know, there's forgiveness. That's a different concept to us. We have utu and we have other means of reparation, but always you have to watch your back because you don't know whether it's this generation or next generation. Forgiveness was the big circuit breaker that really made a difference. That was a revelation to a lot of Māori. Oh, you mean we don't have to be so fearful? We can get back to our gardens and the trading that we're starting to do. That was actually quite prosperous to us because being at war all the time is not helpful. So this is the next generation of missionaries changed things. Marsden had some idea that we should civilize first. You know, teach them how to be good folks, teach them gardening, teach them these skills, and maybe eventually, I think one of the pieces of advice was sing Christian hymns and so that they can see that you're happy. But those early missionaries weren't happy. They were struggling to even survive and arguing amongst themselves. So it took somebody organised like Henry Williams, a former naval, not a captain, a lieutenant or something, came out as the new head of the Church Missionary Society on Marsden's fourth visit. Marsden keeps coming back. So he brings stability, discipline and direction. And what happened was that he built mana. He built a reputation. He won the confidence of many Māori chiefs by spending time with them so that they respected him enough that when he heard that this tribe or that hapu or that group were going into battle against this group, he had the confidence to be able to step in and go, "Tai ho, guys, hang on a minute. and he'd probably have somebody in there who knew a bit of the Bible. Maybe he'd read some of the principles or whatever, but he was a peacemaker. He was able to do that, not because he was timid, but because he was bold and because he built relationships and trust. So this was a big game changer. And his brother, William Williams, a scholarly surgeon, came out and took over the schooling and the translation work that had been going on with the Wesleyans and the Anglicans. Well, the Church Missionary Society will bring Anglicans in later. So these are volunteer missionaries who've decided to commit their lives to come to Aotearoa to be part of helping to change an understanding of the one God, not the many gods, but the one God and the principles that he teaches through the Bible. So he worked on Te Kawanatahau, which is the New Testament, and began working on a dictionary of the Maori language. And Henry said of his brother, he appears not to simply learn it, it seems to naturally flow from him. So somehow he'd got into this understanding of Maori language and conversation, which he must have been able to be having quite fluently and confident that people were understanding him, to be really involved in the translation of things into te reo, which is how the language... I mean, there's an oral culture going on at the same time. Maori, having been at these schools, have absorbed this knowledge and have incredible memories, because sometimes Maori were able to remember 12 generations of whakapapa, of their generations. So everything was oral. They had incredible memories, and they went back to their own people when they were released often from captive under Ngāpuhi in the far north, and go back to their own people and start telling them about this gospel message. So around about now they need a printer, and we have William Colenso, who's an interesting fellow, and he kind of upset his parents back in Cornwall because he used to go to all the churches, not just the Anglican church. He'd go to I'm not sure he went to the Catholic one, but he'd go to the Quakers and he'd go to the Wesleyans, and they were all pretty separated there. You either belong to one and you stay there, or you don't go, and his parents are going, what are you doing? But he had a passion to be a missionary, and he also went along to the Bible Society, where they were printing in London as an apprentice printer, and he was hearing all the stories about what was happening with mission fields around the world, and he heard the story that Henry and William Williams and the missionaries in Aotearoa were looking for a printer, and he put his hand up and he said, "Send me, I want to go there, but I also want to be ordained as a missionary," which is another story. So he arrived on the 30th of December 1834 at Paihia, aged 23. We often think about the apostles of Christ. Some of these paintings have them as bearded old men. They weren't. They were mostly young, vibrant people, full of life, fishermen, whatever they were. Is anybody watching The Chosen on the TV? Have you seen that on YouTube? You should have a look at it. It's very interesting the way they present the early disciples of Christ. They make them very real and honest and scrappers and ordinary people like us. And you think, why didn't we get that kind of picture first off? So have a look at it. Chosen. It's a good one. So here's a young man, 23, out to Aotearoa, and he'd given instructions, but nobody listened to him properly. And when he arrived, when they finally put two waka together and get the printing press sitting on the waka, and everybody's gathering around, and goodness me, this is a huge thing, and they finally get it ashore, and they put it in a darkened shed where he's got to work, and then he opens the box that's supposed to have everything in it for his trade, and discovers that half the things he asked for aren't there. There's no imposing table where he's got to lay up all the type. So he's got all this lead type, but not so he Kiwi number 8 wire, found a big chunk of wood. But the worst thing that they'd forgot to deliver was paper. How on earth are you supposed to print books without paper? So he said to the missionaries, guys, you won't be writing home for the next 6 months because I'm commandeering all your paper. So the first stuff that was printed off Colenso's printing press was printed on the paper that the missionaries might otherwise have written home with. So in 7 weeks, he had 25 copies of Philippians and Ephesians in te reo Māori. Now that is an incredible feat. by December 1835, 1,000 copies of Luke and 5,000 copies of the entire New Testament. That is an incredible achievement. After that point, they had to go to England because the demand was so important and so great that Māori now, instead of wanting a musket as the thing that we must have, is that we want a copy of the New Testament. Octavius Hadfield, who becomes conscience of the nation, he's 24 years old, and he wants to come out and be a missionary. That is his heart's desire, but he's got asthma, he's got health problems, and they won't give him permission to do it. So he sneaks through the back roads, got a friend in Australia who's a bishop, gets ordained, comes here anyway, gets really frustrated when they try to make him become a teacher to the Pākehā missionary kids. That's not what I came here for. And then this job comes up down in the Kapiti Coast. And he says, I'll go. If I've got to die down there, I'll commit. I don't care. I've come here to be amongst Māori. I want to be part of something that I've heard is happening in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I have heard that there's a revival going on. So he befriended and defended Māori for many years against the wishes of the government. He was a troublemaker, but he stood alongside Māori for so long. And you know, this guy who thought that he might not last very long at all lived to be 91 years old and became the first bishop of New Zealand. We ought to know that. Hohepe Ripahau, also known as Matahau, an evangelist, a storyteller, a peacemaker from Ngatiawa. He was a captive heading to Otaki from Paia after he'd been let go. He'd been at the mission school there. He had a copy of Octavius Hadfield's, Colenso's Gospel of Luke. And he's going through the Rotorua area. He's in, and there's been an attack on Reverend Brown's Matamata station, and 12-year-old Turori, the daughter of Te Waharoa, one of those warlike chiefs, has said she's at the mission station. She's learning the gospel, and Wirimu Ngā Kuku, her father, he's a preacher, but she's caught trying to escape. They're trying to get out of there because there's been a revival of the wars between two people there, and a guy called Paura Tioita kills her and takes the Gospel of Luke, and Ripahau, as he's walking through, Uita's saying, well, what is this? Why is this so important? What is this thing that was in the little kitty bag around this girl's neck? And then Ripahau says, I'll read it to you. So he reads about the prodigal son, reads about the Good Samaritan, and Tioita, like those people in the book of Acts, when they heard the gospel preached to them, was pricked in their hearts and said, what do we need to do to be forgiven? Tioita asks forgiveness from Wirimu Ngā Kuku, who's Tarori's dad, and eventually he says, no, let's not seek retribution. And peace is made between Waikato and Rotorua. So there's peacemaking going on in the midst of the most chaotic situations. The Kapiti College Bible College Outreach, I call it, 1838 at Otaki, Ripahau's gone down there, and he's sitting with these young sons of chiefs. He's sitting there with Tamihana, or Katu Te Raupraha, the son of Te Raupraha, who's been one of the great warriors, who's just caused great devastation, and with his muskets and all the others. And he's there with Matene Te Whiwhi, another influential person, his cousin, and 8 others, and he teaches them from the Gospel of Luke. And they all get excited, and they go, hang on a minute, we want to know more about this. And they go to the whalers and they get pencils and they start to learn to read and write, and they start to begin to get a sense of passion and purpose. And Te Raupraha doesn't like that, so they go off to Kapiti Island where they're not going to be bothered, and they continue to learn, and they say, we need to have a teacher. We need somebody to come and teach us. So they go to the Bay of Islands and ask for a missionary. And who comes down? It's Hadfield, where we talked about before. Hadfield comes down with Henry Williams, but just recently, I used to talk about Tamihana and Matene Te Whiwhi, and I knew that there were others. And then I've been talking to my friend Richard Te Tau, and I spoke to his cousin, Ken Te Tau, and I began to get confirmation that one of those others who was part of what was beginning to happen, this peacemaking movement that's starting to evolve in the Bay of Islands and will spread around the country, comes from Wairarapa. Te Kawenga Te Tau gets baptized up in the Bay of Islands. He's gone up there because there's all sorts of stuff going. Maori are hearing all around the country. There's stuff going on up in the Bay of Islands. Something's changing. Remember what was said, everything's changing, everything's moving. This word's got around the country. Maori, through their kumarawain, through their connections, through their sharing of stories, they're all aware that something's vibrating up there, something's happening there. And Te Kawenga, he goes up there and he gets baptized, a Catholic, I'm told. So what's going on? You've got he's a Catholic, and you've got Matane Te Whiwhi and Tamihana are getting baptized by Henry Williams. So they're crossing some barriers here. They're not listening to the denominational stuff that divides. They're listening to the voice of God in their heart that says, actually, something's changed for us, and we need to get together and be part, because we see the danger of what's going on here. We see the danger of our people at war with each other, and we need to listen to this gospel of peace. How can we bring things together and be part of something fresh here? So the trio become committed intertribal peacemakers. Te Kawenga arranges for more poko over in Lake Wairarapa, to come across to Lake Wairarapa, to get out of the way of some of the warfare that's threatening their areas there. And Octavius Hadfield arrives in 1839, just after that, reinforcing this idea of peacemaking, bringing the gospel even closer to them. And 1843, Tamihana and Te Whiwhi go down to Ngaitahu, where Te Raupraha has caused devastation, and take their lives in their hand by asking for forgiveness and preaching and confirming peace with words of the gospel of the Lord. Late 1840s and 50s, the trio helped form the Land League, which is the beginning of the Kingitanga movement. So there's a whole lot of connections there that really make sense to me. So Maori missionaries lead the ways. Musket War slaves learn at the Far North mission schools, at Paihia, at Waimati North, at Te Kaeo, at Hokianga, and Maori take the gospel to their own iwi, in their own way. Henry Williams sees 1,000 at church near Gisborne, influenced by Ngāti Parao chief Piripi Taumata Akura, or Philip the teacher. He'd been up north, he'd learned the gospel, he'd taken it back to his own people, and when the missionaries got there, they were already singing hymns, they already had Sunday as a special day, but the trouble was that they were heading into a warfare situation, and thousands were gathered, and there was going to be bloodshed, but he had to speak to them from the Bible and say, all right, I'll come with you, but you have to change the rules about how you conduct war. We have to do things differently. So that's an incredible story on its own. So 1,000 at church near Gisborne, including some from Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa. And we don't know who influenced who, but Wairarapa Māori were there. April 1835, Tamihana Te Waharo, one of my favourite ambassadors, poets, writers, just an incredible person, was converted, and he said to his dad, Te Waharoa, I'm not going to succeed you and go into battle and do what you did. Something's changed my heart. I'm going to become a different kind of person. He was reading, writing, and teaching within 6 months, and he continues to teach after that attack that involved Turuori, that caused her loss of life, and that amazing story comes out of there. By 1846, he's got a village called Peria, and that's the Bereans. In the book of Acts, the Bereans were the ones who studied the gospel, and they said, hang on a minute, we need to check out the gospel and make sure that you're not telling titos, that you actually got it right, that you're not trying to influence us in a negative way. So they go back and they come at, you're right, no, hang on a minute, we need to discuss this a bit more. So he had a village called Peria, which was based on the 10 Commandments. You weren't allowed to drink in there. You had to start to behave a little bit differently, but they were hugely productive. They had their own flour mill, etc., etc. And his story is an incredible story. So 1838 to 40, the Wairarapa, the Musket Wars resulted in Māori from Hawke's Bay, where I live, and from Wairarapa to go to Nukutaurua. That's where Toiroa came from, wasn't it? The prophet was up there because they didn't have muskets in that early stage, and they were invaded from tribes on all sides who came in and decimated them. And the safest thing was to go under the guidance of Wira Hauraki from Ngāpui in the far north, who said, all right, I'll look after you. But there were also whaling stations up there, so they began to gather muskets, but they looked after each other, they defended each other, they stayed there. William Williams brought the gospel there, and the thought is that a lot of Wairarapa Māori picked up on the gospel from William Williams there, and it wasn't until about 1838 that they started to come back here, because they'd gone from here. Most had gone from there. There'd been invasion from Wellington had come through and really caused some problems, so they joined their Ngāti Kahanunu relatives at Nukutaurua. Tikawinga Te Tau was a major Christian influence. When he came back here and when he came back with the people, he brought the gospel with him and influenced a lot of people. So by the early 1840s, it was found that a number of villages here had houses of worship. 1843, Kalenzo's here and he finds 80 believers at Mataikona. Is that how you say it? How do you say it? Is that right? Okay. There were Maori teachers here, there was a Maori school, many were baptized. This is not long after they've come back from what we call exile. There was stuff going on. These guys were excited about this new faith that had come for them. Soon more Maori teachers in chapels, and among the chiefs who were preaching the gospel was Hoani Mehana Te Rangiotu from over at Rangatani, who brought the gospel here and was teaching as well. He was part of the Church Missionary Society. Now when I see a little thing like that, how are we going for time? Have I got your attention? Are we doing all right? I'll let you tell me if I'm off track. So 1840, William Deans comes over here with a Māori guide to explore Palliser Bay. He goes back and he tells everybody about the wonderful pasture land that's in Wairarapa, and then promptly moves to Canterbury. So he didn't follow through, he took off, but suddenly the word's out. Hey, there's great pasture land over here. When the Wairarapa exiles return, after making peace with their Taranaki rivals, who'd caused part of the Raru in the first place, they find that other tribes are starting to move in on their territory and trying to sell it. Now, Tikawinga Te Tau has a major influence on trying to bring some peace there, and I think I told you most of that anyway. You don't like to hear me double up on stuff, do you? So what did we do next here? Excuse me, backwards and forwardsing, but I just want to make sure you get all the bits in between. I'm going to leave lots out, but this will give you a broad brush picture. So what is the legacy? What does all this mean, this bringing of the gospel to Aotearoa? What was the value of it? Because I hear people saying, the missionaries came and they destroyed Māori culture and the chiefs lost their power and, wish the missionaries had never come. But I wouldn't like to explore what things might have been like if peace hadn't been made. So it was the peacemaking role of the missionaries. I firmly believe that. It wasn't civilization, as some people try to say. Oh no, they were just more civilized and they were tired of warfare. Might have been part of it, but this message of forgiveness, this circuit breaker, this idea that we don't have to be at odds with each other. We can actually be friends and we can intermarry and we can build for the future has more credibility to me. As does the idea that there's now one God rather than many gods or atua, and I think sometimes poetically we miss the possibilities in there, but there was fear and superstition and lots of it about, and tapu, and we could touch on that a little bit later. So Christianity, we're all equal and equally loved under one God, an end to the class system. Some people say there was no class system, what are you talking about? Well, some people weren't treated as well as other people, and some people did all of the work while the other people waited them to finish doing all of that work, and some people were taken from other tribes and made to do. What do you call that? That's just a different form of, of a class system. Of course it was. And we've still got class systems. I hate the idea that there are second-class people. We're all, and under God, we're all one people, and we should be helping each other along when those people around us are struggling. We need to see that because that's the compassion that we've been given. If we're all in God's image, then He wants to see us all get a hand up, whatever that looks like. So the rules of war had changed. Cannibalism had ended. Forgiveness rather than utu. And I remember somebody said that they had a little competition. How can you say in six words, actually probably this is all I should have said. I should have just got up and said this and gone home. Forgiveness, 6 words: forgiveness, a circuit breaker releasing futures. I like that. I don't care whether you like it or not. To me, that says it. It releases you, it releases the other party, and it says now we can have a future because we're not always worried about the past. So backwards into the future, yep, we got to get under that carpet, we've got to clean it up, and we've got to make the way clear so that we can have a future together. Hei iwi tahi tātou, not the Don Brash version, but how can we two peoples work together, work out our differences, work a way forward, because we've got an amazing future. Because if we don't grab that real soon, I tell you that we are being recolonized now, digitally and every other way, and if we don't decide who we are and what we want for the future, somebody else will decide that for us. So the CMS, that's the Church Missionary Society, and the Wesleyan Missionary Society worked together to produce translations until the bishop came in and said, we don't do that. The Church Missionary Society cannot talk with the Wesleyans. No. So we break it, and then we get into the class system again of bishops now dictating what should happen within the church. And it's unfortunately messed with amazing relationships where people work together. So we had a communications revolution right throughout the country. Many Māori were more literate than the settlers right up to the 1860s. A lot of those whalers could hardly scratch their names. A lot of Māori were literate and fluently poetic as they wrote letters to the Crown and to the government in England, explaining very carefully the situation that they were faced with and saying, we want a voice in our own affairs. This is where we're going to go in the second part, having a voice. So Māori evangelized themselves north and south. By 1836, this was one of the most successful mission fields in the world, and at least 60% of Māori were Christians. I think it might have been more than that, but I'm not sure. Who knows the music of AC/DC? Oh, you'll love it, I know. Look at that up the back there, Back in Black and all that stuff. But I like that one, dirty deals done dirt cheap. Yeah, well, this is what happened here. It's what happened in Aotearoa, corporate colonisation, roads in Wakefield. I told you a bit about them before. Speculators who purchased land that they didn't have the right to protect, and on-sold it. So I've got here, speculators sold land they didn't have before acquiring it from those who didn't own it, despite British and Maori and missionary opposition. So the New Zealand Company was told by the Aborigines Protection Society and by both missionary organisations, we don't want the New Zealand Company here. It is going to interrupt all of the business that we're doing here. The British government agreed with them and said no, but the New Zealand Company on its ship came out anyway because they saw the profit opportunity. So they're told not to. We have colonies enough. So 1839, Henry Williams with Octavius Hadfield is in Wellington as Wakefield's ship. William Wakefield's ship has arrived and is doing dirty deals real cheap with a truck, I think 600 pounds worth of gunpowder, red blankets, nails, Jews' harps. What on earth are Māori going to do with Jews' harps? All of the stuff in order to get their signatures on a piece of paper And these guys didn't have the right to sell the land anyway for everything that could be seen from Queen Charlotte Sound all the way to Taranaki, all of Wellington, and some of them were saying, oh, and that land in Wairarapa, you can have that too if I just have a couple more blankets. So all of that was going on at the time as Henry Williams and the missionaries arrived, but he couldn't catch up with Wakefield and his ship because the wind was going the wrong way, and when he got to Wellington, Maori there were saying, this is terrible. These people are claiming they've purchased our land. What can we do about it? It was allegedly too late. So ships were arriving in Nelson, Wellington, Whanganui and Taranaki, and when the settlers arrived, they discovered they've been conned too. There are no white picket fences. There are no quarter-acre sections. There are no jobs. But we listen to your advertising. Well, that'll teach you to believe everything you read in the newspaper advertising section. So that was pretty sad. No lifestyle block. All right. Where do we go from there? Did that. In England, the humanitarian Christians who are in Parliament, after 26 years, are forced to realise that they can no longer ignore what's going on in Aotearoa and they need to be doing something. And here's one of those golden threads, is that the nephew of William Wilberforce, he's the Undersecretary, James Stephen Jr. He's the Undersecretary. He's in a really good position of influence, and he said, Britain cannot do what it has done to every other nation that it has colonised. We cannot do this anymore. He says, Maori are an independent people. Their interests are to be protected. Britain doesn't own it. It has a settled form of government, and Maori were, after their own rude fashion, agriculturalists. So he gives instructions to Lord Normanby, and those instructions are given to Hobson, the new Governor-General, and a draft is given to Henry and Edward Williams. So Henry's just arrived back from being down here at the Kapiti Coast. He gets back and he's got, how long's he got? He's got 18 hours to translate this into Te Reo Māori and to English in order to have it presented the next day at a gathering of tribes that Colenso sent invitations out for that will be called the Treaty of Waitangi. And Henry says, I did everything I possibly could to avoid expressions of the English where no term or expression in Māori was available and preserve the entire spirit and tenor of the treaty. So, 5th of February, a colourful drama plays out. All explained, a whole day of explanations. Some people saying, no, we don't want a treaty, we don't want governors, go away, get out of here, we don't need you, you're just troublemakers, all you do is bring rum and gunpowder and all the rest of it. And then somebody gets up and say, no, it's the missionaries who've balanced that out and said that no more gunpowder and the rum's bad for us and they're teaching our children. No, we say, come and be a governor for us. And this goes on all day. And if you've been to the marae, if you've sat and watched what goes on the pai, it's always a drama. It's always everybody getting out all of the issues that they have and explaining their frustrations. And then maybe, if it works out, we have a cup of tea afterwards and we're friends again because we've said what we needed to. You didn't have to stand on that point. We were having an open wananga, a discussion. And I think this is important. This is an important principle. We need to have open discussions. And Colenso says, just as nobody's moving to get it signed. And Colenso says, do Māori fully understand what they're about to sign? And Governor Hobson says, well, it's no fault of mine if they don't. So Busby calls out Hickey's name. Now, Honi Hickey's an interesting fellow because he used to run around with the Bible under his arm and always go for advice with Henry Williams. And they would have these long discussions. So some would say he was a Christian. But he's also very representative of his people and very hungry for trade benefits because he sees that this treaty is going to bring income into his people. So he's very happy about that. So he's the first one that goes forward and signs, and then everybody else comes after him. But Hickey said that Māori would have to rely on the missionaries. And this, I think, is a really important. 540 Māori chiefs signed 9 copies, including 13 women rangatira. The majority signed the Māori version, and it is viewed by many as a sacred kawanata. My point, there would be no Treaty of Waitangi if the missionaries were not involved. So the church cannot sit there smugly in our pews and go, well, it's not our business. Because it is our business, we inherit that because the missionaries were our forebears and they were saying that this is a godly document, and Māori believed it was a kawanata, and the language that was used at the time came from the Bible. So there's a covenant, like a marriage, like an agreement to work things out no matter how difficult things got. So let's leave it at there. I think, have I done 40 or 45, or have I been up here for 2 hours already? Eh? Oh, well, we're blowing my time. I'll just get carried away. So, I mean, awesome that I think you're attentive. I think you're listening, and hopefully I haven't bored you. But this is our history. History shouldn't be boring. I mean, I think that we are living in historic times. We are part of history. How we respond to the gospel, how we respond to history, how we are with each other is all part of an unfolding story. If we're mean to each other, then consequences happen, isn't it? But if we learn to be kind, and if we learn to think and to have proper and open discussions, I think that we have an amazing future in Aotearoa down here where the sun first rises for something amazing to happen in the future. So let's move to the left, let's move to the right and have a cup of coffee. Let's take a break for about 10 minutes or something like that. Have a biscuit, have a kōrero, have a hongi. Thanks.
If I could ask everyone to slowly but surely return to your seats, we'd like to get started with the second session for tonight.
Everybody happy? Did we lose anybody? We didn't lose too many people, did we? No? Listen, I thought I've been doing all the talking. Has anybody got any questions that are just burning that they would like to throw out at me kindly? I'm open, yep. The second part will deal with a little bit more interesting Wairarapa history. Boy, you've got some interesting history here. That's forced me to look into it a little bit more deeply. Please go. Yep.
So in recent months, there's been a bit of a move in the education world in New Zealand to move back to teaching New Zealand history. Do you feel as though or maybe not the perspectives, but the content that you're presenting tonight will make its way into that reality?
Probably not. But that's up to you. I think there will be flexibility enough in what the curriculum provides for your local teachers and school board to decide what resources they want to use. And I think part of that will be in conjunction with, where possible, local iwi. And I think, I use that word a lot, don't I? Because I do, I think about this. I imagine that a good thing, if we're coming from a Christian perspective, is do we have relationships with other Christian Maori who are part of our communities, because I'm not sure that we're a very representative group in a lot of ways. Have we built those relationships with local iwi, with tangata whenua, with mana whenua, with karaiti Maori? And if not, why not? And then why, if we get concerned that the Christian story isn't being represented in our school, perhaps that's why. Because we haven't built those relationships, and it's late in the game, guys. So really our churches need to be working with local marae and working with local Maori Christians. And too often, this is one of my big concerns, and when I hear from Māori often, is that we come to church and we sit at the back and we try to interact, but we never get invited back to your place for a meal. We never really feel part of it. We'd like to be. And then the pastor goes, oh, there's Māori folk coming into our church, isn't it wonderful? And then 2 weeks later, I wonder what happened to them. Well, it's like anybody, isn't it, who comes into a church. So often, we're not very good at manakitanga. We're not very good at being hospitable. We're very good at the, good to see you, pat on the back. See you next week. Why? For the numbers, or for how much you're going to get in the plate, or because you're building relationships? You know, we're part of the problem. But if we establish those relationships, and then it flows two ways, and we end up at the marae, and then the marae might come to the church. You know, when Māori are comfortable in a church and they feel that they are an equal member of the body of Christ along with everybody else, they might just bring their family. And the Māori connection to a lot of people should never be underestimated. You don't know that your well-treating of and making friends with and making an effort beyond the backslap, you don't know what impact that might have on a community. You don't know whether somebody's a spy looking into the promised land to see, what's the fruit like here? Is it exciting? Am I being inspired by the message? Is there something going on there that I need to tell my neighbours about? And if they do, I mean, that could relate to anybody, but if we're not connecting with Māori and we're talking about Māori, then that's the problem. There they go, talking about us again, not talking to us. Any other questions?
An observation in government at the moment, there's more of a direction to go. You mentioned into more of a partnership or co-governance model with Māori, and I was interested in your perspective on how that maybe talks to the principles of the treaty, and whether or not you think that more accurately reflects those principles.
Yeah, I think it does, because if you look at your own history here in the Wairarapa and you look at what happened at Papawai, for example, this is what Māori wanted all along, was they wanted to be treated as equals to British citizens, and they wanted to have a voice, but that voice, there was no articulation given to that voice. There was no mechanism for Māori to be able to have a say. These decisions were made for them, but, whether it was the Declaration of Independence, whether it was the allocation of the trading flag, because Māori were trading, around the Pacific, but didn't have a flag. So there was an agreement. There was huge trading opportunities going on, and that's a whole story in itself. But not having a say in the legislation or the decisions that were made, or not listened to when they said taiho, the land league that became the kingitanga, for example, you're taken. Who said? There was a quote I saw recently. It was Te Raupraha's cousin, Te Rangihaiata, who was finally, having a conversation about some more land, and he said, listen, you've already taken Taranaki, you've taken Wellington, you've taken the Wairarapa. When will you be satisfied? That's how Māori felt. But there was no takatori. There was no two-way conversation where Māori felt that their voice was heard. And even at Papawai here in the 1880s, as all the tribes were coming together and going, well, we need to have a united stand and let's support our Māori representatives in Parliament, said and played along for a long time and then said, into their attempt to get rid of the Native Lands Act, which meant long queues waiting for issues to be dealt with that took forever, he just walked away and pretty much said, nah. So now we've got a situation where Māori are not going to put up with that anymore. And representation in local councils and representation, why wouldn't we want to listen? Maybe Māori have answers about, maybe we need to be challenged about the mess that our rivers are in. Maybe we need to be challenged about being better kaitiaki or caretakers of our resources in this time when climate change is such an issue. Why wouldn't we discuss that? Because this is their tohunga and our ability to let industry continue to pour toxic wastes into our river. There's a whole thing there. We need to hear the mamai, the pain of Papatūānuku, of Māori saying, you took our land but you're not even looking after it. Or we have some better ideas about how to deal with people who you continue to put in prison. There's got to be a better way. Our imprisonment rate is so high. Our mental health rate is so high because we try and treat everybody the same. We're not all the same. We're different. And when Māori get locked up, like maybe it's a bit like the Aboriginal suicide rate when they get thrown into prison. This is just, how can we deal with this? Rather than having a communal way of, there's so many ideas. And I think that creativity is the new game changer. And Māori they're more in tune with the rhythm of Aotearoa than a lot of us are. And we've got to start listening to the rhythm of the land, to the rhythm of the nation. Listen to Stan Walker's music, for goodness sake. Who's heard Stan Walker's music? Who's read his book? Man, that's enough to break your heart. And he's still a God-loving, peace-advocating, beautiful, I think he's part of the soundtrack of what's coming. We need to listen to what Māori is saying through music, through drama, through creativity, through art. We could learn from that. We've become so linear and so Western that this is such a rigid system, it feels like it's going to break. We need to have these conversations now. And yes, I think we do need to be around the same table and learning to listen, not talk over each other. It's not a competition. Co-opetition is the way forward, isn't it? And when we do that together, we go, I never thought about it like that. And suddenly there's something opens up. Something fresh opens up. Not sure that I actually answer the questions. I just have another rant, don't I? Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look and see where we can get to, because what have I got here? Backward living. This is what the treaty's meant to be about, isn't it? A living relational document. Hei iwi ko tahi tātou. We are now one people. But that's a scripture actually that comes from Galatians 3:26 to 29, where God's calling us not to be the same, not to be assimilated, not to be, identical. That's nonsense. God loves Māori people. God loves Asian people. He loves South Africans. He loves wherever you come from. He loves unity, but he loves diversity. And that's the trick, isn't it? How do you have unity and still love diversity? Because diversity equals creativity. And if we've got diversity and creativity, then you've got the elements of change, of something wonderful when we respect and learn to see beyond the surface. And so often we make judgments and then go, oh, I didn't realise that person has had one dreadful life story and I made a judgment. What was it about the moko on their face, or the sadness that they showed, or their refusal to connect? If we're Christians, that's the art that we're called to be involved in, isn't it? To manakitanga, the awhi, the caring, the way to actually get to know people in a real way, beyond the surface. Not just one conversation, but really, I'm going to rant again. But I remember one guy, he had a sour face, but he looked interesting, and he gave me, 2-sentence responses. and that was it. And I did this, and about the 5th time, I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "Yeah, I'm all right." "Are you really okay?" He said, "No, mate, if you really want to know, I've got a bloody brain tumour." "Oh, okay." So now we start talking about his issue, and we pray, and we get to know him, and this guy's in pain. But people have been fobbing him off, never getting past base 1. We've got to get past base 2 and 3. What's really going on here? And, God gives us the capacity for that. And then if he gives us the capacity for that understanding and compassion, then he also gives us the compassion to be part of the solution. And I think that's our calling, isn't it? It's got to be. Otherwise, what are we here? Just bumping around, bumping each other around and who knows what. Okay, so Dame Joan Metje says, we many peoples together make a nation, and it's a kawanata. And that's what Māori understood the treaty to be. A covenant, a spiritual thing, a thing that was an agreement that went beyond what was written on the paper, an agreement that was to do with the desires of people to really get to know each other. And if we don't get to know each other, how can we truly understand what that relationship means? It's about an ongoing conversation, or kotahitanga. How can we stand together as one people? Yep, partnership, protection and participation is a modern understanding of some of that through Justice Cook, but still this is a contemporary way of understanding. How can we be good partners? How can we protect so that things don't get continually lost? And participation is the answer to the question. We need to be participating together. I mean, you've seen the treaty, right? And oral culture is also supposed to, protect religious beliefs. That's there as well, the phantom clause. So you should know that. 1845. Missionary advice was starting to be ignored. The Christians in the colonial office had gone now, and Earl Grey is making his wastelands dispatch to Governor Grey. In other words, land that's not being used or profitably gardened or whatever. Well, we'll consider that ours. I beg your pardon? Māori are nomadic. Well, not nomadic, but they move between different places during different seasons for different food types, and that's just what they do. They have arrangements, and they leave behind an ahika, which is the home fires that are under the ground somewhere. There'll be coals that are still warm because we're coming back. But all of this individual property title ignores all of that, puts a fence around it and says, that's mine. And so this is a whole different way of understanding things, and this is what caused problems. And when Earl Grey did that, Henry Williams said, that's a warrant for the extermination of Māori. How dare you do that? Now, Governor Grey didn't actually implement that, but he found other ways to do exactly the same here and other places around the country because he wanted the land at whatever cost it would come, and the pressure was on to do that. So Henry Williams defended the treaty. He had some more copies of the Māori Treaty printed to try and convince the chiefs who were going, hang on a minute, this is not what we agreed. And then he had to turn round and go, I actually feel betrayed and appalled at the attempted violation of the treaty. And he said he would never again plead the honour and integrity of Her Majesty's government, which appeared to be lost or perhaps never possessed. That's incredible that Henry Williams would say that. So we've got Māori and missionaries both feeling entirely betrayed by this new approach of the government that runs roughshod over the deal that was done with Christians in the colonial office who thought we were going to do things differently than had been done anywhere in the world. I think we need to understand that. And when you look at George Clark, who was the Chief Protector of Aborigines, and Chief Justice Martin also said this: the expressive language used and fully understood by both parties to the treaty was this, that the shadow of the land was to be the Queen's sovereignty, and the substance was to remain to the native chiefs, their lands and the tino rangatiratanga or chieftainship over their own tribes. George Clark said that, Chief Protector of Aborigines, and Governor Hobson had the Protector of Aborigines office in place to ensure that these deals were looked after. Governor Grey comes in and abolished the office and replaces it with the Commissioner for Extinguishment of Native Title. I mean, that's appalling, isn't it? The missionaries are there to protect, and Governor Grey goes, actually, I don't like what you missionaries are doing. You're making my job harder, so I'm going to get rid of the office that you've done, and I'm going to take the office back and create a new group that says, actually, how can we get more land off you without having to go through the missionaries who are just a thorn in my side, really. So the smear campaign begins against Henry Williams. They accuse him. He gets defrocked. And then we've got the land protests in Wairau down in the South Island. Honi Haki starts cutting the flagpole down. In come the militia. This is the beginning of the land wars. So while Henry Williams was considered to be the father of the tribes by Maori in the far north, Bishop Selwyn's here now, and they accuse him of illegal land holdings. He's actually a thorn on the side of the land grabbers. So poor old Henry Williams has just been maligned left, right and centre, accused of all sorts of things. So what does he do? He builds a church on his own land and continues to invite Maori to come along and continues to supply them with goods. And he'd paid more for that land that he purchased off Maori than anybody else had paid anyway. He was a fair man. And so this whole fake news continued to happen. By 1847 to 53, the Crown controls much of the North Island, all of the South Island, and most of the place 10% reserves. And I think one of the things that was saying, well, I think Wakefield said this. He said, "Oh, we'll leave 10% reserves for Maori chiefs, and but they can come and inhabit the land once they've proven that they're of a suitable type of person, perhaps." So there's some horrible goings on. So land acquisition by stealth. Colenso, what an amazing guy, really. I mean, sure, he was had an affair with his house girl, and that was. That blew it all up. He lost his job and Māori failed to trust him. But, if you think about the story about Colenso, who Bishop Selwyn would not ordain him unless he was married. Bishop Selwyn almost arranged the marriage for him because he met with Elizabeth, what's her name? Who became his wife across near the Coram Thames area. And they met. It was like an arranged, they'd written to each other, but there was no spark. It's going, not going to happen really, is it? No, I don't think so. So he goes back to Bishop Selwyn, and Bishop Selwyn says, I'm not going to ordain you as a missionary unless you get married to that girl. He wanted Elizabeth to come and work in his Māori girls' school because she was really proficient at the Māori language. So he had ulterior motives. So he forced Colenso to go and get married, and it was a loveless marriage. So you can understand that there are a lot of things at play beneath the surface in this relationship, and you can also perhaps understand why he decided to walk such long distances down through the Wairarapa so often, through this widespread mission area that he had, often telling Māori once he heard that the pressure was on them to sell their land, he said, don't sell the land, hang on to it, and lease only small blocks. So if you're going to sell it, insist on large reserves. Because Governor Fitzroy opened it up for a bit for direct sales, and then Governor Grey came back and said, no, closed the deal on that and called all those people who'd bought that land squatters. So this is all a bit complex, I know. So by 1847, Grey helps the New Zealand Company buy 150,000 acres here. So there's initially the New Zealand Company, their purchases have been considered by post-treaty as not legitimate, some of them, but they still got to keep some, and they got paid a certain amount for the land that they claim to have purchased, and then they get brought on as a government land purchasing agent, and when then there were grass leases here, and Māori were doing really well. There were about up to 12 big leaseholders in Wairarapa, and Māori thought, we've got a good relationship. We'll supply the labour, we'll supply the food, you pay us for leasing the land, it's a good deal. And then Māori go, well, actually, there's more and more people wanting to come here. Well, let's just put the price up a little bit. So the squatters get together, go to the New Zealand company, go to Governor Grey and say, no, we don't want to lease anymore. We want to own the land. So the pressure's now on to acquire the land. And then Governor Grey says, actually, unless you sell the land, you won't get any more leasehold money. In fact, unless you sell the land, we'll tell the land purchasers to go elsewhere. So Māori are kind of caught in a difficult situation. They're being pressured to sell. So this is really what happens. And Māori didn't trust the promises of ample reserves and hospitals and schools and all the rest of it, and rightly so. They resisted selling to the Crown, but the pressure kept increasing. From 1849, there's so many settlers here that they're heading up my way now. This became the back door into Hawke's Bay, with sheep farmers moving and doing exactly the same thing in Hawke's Bay, arranging with Māori for grass leases, which then they were told were illegal, and that's how they called the 12 apostles down our way, the 12 large landholders that ended up owning most of the Hiratonga Plains, and their descendants still pretty much do today. So we went 6th. All right, Māori, Committee Nui was formed here too. Again, let's have a big gathering. Let's talk about this. Let's have a conversation about what's going on. But if we're not careful, we will have no land left for ourselves. So Donald Maclean and Governor Grey, they come together to Committee Nui, a gathering of all of the tribes around the area, and they do a big PR spin. They say, no, this is really good that you sell your land. It'll be great for you. There'll be lots of spin-offs, lots of good benefits for you. And it's like the marriage between two people. He's spinning yarns, and Maclean's great at te reo, and he knows that Māori love good stories. So they're telling all of these stories. We'll give you reserves and hospitals and schools and this close ties with the settlers. It'll be so good for everybody. But none of that pretty much happens. So the trouble is, Māori have now agreed, and Maclean buys the majority of the land for the Crown. So this is from 1853, Greytown, Tauhira Nikau Block, Masterton, Whakaori, which actually means chanting with the birds. Apparently the old folks used to sit there on the edge of the forest and listen to the sound of the birds and just tune into it and just have soft chants that were similar to the sound of the birds, and that's where that name came from, the original name before it was changed to Joseph Masters' name, who was the Small Farms Association, who buys and sells the town sections while the Crown sells the farms. I understand he probably wasn't a bad sort of a bloke, and that there were all sorts of benefits that came back to the community, but this is what happened here anyway. Government acquisition rapidly escalates, and Māori are left with little for their own families and their economy. Elsewhere around the country, we've got the land wars breaking out. Governor Gore Brown breaks Wiremu-Kingi Te Rangataki's Waitara title, and this is Māori land has been in customary ownership, but here something happened that changed that. A deal was done where one guy offers the Waitara land for £200, and Maclean agrees to it, and Wiremu-Kingi, who had been involved with Hadfield, it was Hadfield's best mate. When he got down there, he stayed with Wiremu-Kingi at Otaki, and he was a peacemaker, and he was a gospel man, and he prevented Te Raupraha from attacking Wellington, and Hadfield said, this was the best friend that Pākehā ever had, and here you are, you're pushing him off his land. And then they sign a martial law edict before anybody's done anything. This was done behind the scenes. Governor Gore Brown signed a martial law request before anything had happened, and the old people had gone out and pulled up the stakes at Waitara where the surveyors were putting it in, and that was considered an act of war, and the first person to fire a weapon there was a surveyor. So this illegal war in Waitara, in came the big cannons, the ships were already waiting, and you know what really hacked off Wiremu-Kingi Te Rangataki was the fact that the one of the first things to go up in flames was his wharekarakia, a place where all his New Testaments were. He was really annoyed. He tried to be a peacekeeper, and that's the beginning of the peaceful, the peacekeeping. Really, it was the old folks went out and pulled up the surveyor's pegs, and that was considered an act of war. For goodness' sake, so that's pretty heavy. So the ultimatum then moves from Taranaki to Waikato, where Māori are told that unless you give up your idea of having a king, you will be considered rebels. So this whole land movement that involved people from here looking for ways to have a conversation with the government about where do we stop this? Where does this land grab end so that we can still have enough land to live on? But you continue to pressure us, and you continue to look for ways to divide and conquer. How can we do this? All right, so we've got Wiremu Tamihana, who's a Christian. He's a peacemaker. He's writing these eloquent letters to the government. He's tried to be a peacemaker in Taranaki, and now he's trying to keep the peace. But every time he went to Gore Brown's office to sit there, he was ignored while others walked in and out, and he said, I felt treated worse than a dog. And he went home, and as we know, down the Great South Road, they're building a road, and in comes all the troops to Waikato into that lush land that ends up dispossessing 15,000 soldiers, invade 3,000 Māori in Waikato, and 1.4 million hectares in Taranaki. Waikato and Tauranga is confiscated. That's just a long story short. There's plenty of books to read about it. In my book, I try to cover it as best I can, but it's heartbreaking stuff. This is our history. So, Te Kawinga, Te Tau. He is your local faith hero. In my mind, this is an incredible man. He conducts a peace expedition to Taranaki, Waikato and Hawke's Bay. He's talking to chiefs. He's talking to different people. He's got the Bible with him. He's trying to broker peace so that the tribes don't go to war amongst each other, to keep to try and keep the tension down. And his son, Taiawhio, was born in 1860, and his name means to go round or encircle, named after the constant peace expeditions of his dad. So in 1869, Te Kawinga, Te Tau, takes a deputation to greet the Duke of Edinburgh in Wellington. It takes local Māori to Wellington to meet up with him. And the Duke gives him and Parione a flag which is called Wairarapa No. 1. Go Wairarapa! Go, go, go! For some reason, he put that on there, and he took that as just like, I suppose, a commissioning. So he grabbed that flag. And the Duke said he hoped that the dark clouds of war would never pass over the Māori of Wairarapa like it had in other parts of the country. So that was encouragement to him. Te Kawinga took the flag and his Bible, and he visited Te Kōti. Who knows about Te Kōti? I mean, Te Kōti is a very interesting fellow. He's been to the Anglican Church. In fact, William Williams kicked him out one day when he turned up drunk. But he was a trader. He was a very smart guy. He'd been to the Wesleyan Church. He'd been to the Catholic Church. He got married and his wife convinced him to be a Catholic for a while. So he's interested in all of this. And then he gets falsely accused of supplying weapons to the enemy when the Ho-Ho broke out. That's a whole other story too that came and encroached on this area. And when he got sent to the Chatham Islands along with the Ho-Ho or Paimariri, which actually means peace and righteousness. When they came back, he was an angry Old Testament prophet, gaining revenge. He was just wild. And there was, the troops were after him. There was a big wild chase through Tūhoe and through different parts of the country around the shores of Lake Taupo. He was the man to be feared. Everybody was chasing him. He was hunting, and there was a burn and destroy up in Tūhoe territory. It was terrible. So Te Kawinga gets it in his mind to go and see Te Kooti. Let me tell you a little bit of a story here. When he met Te Kooti, and I figure this has got to be about 69. No, it can't be that. I can't remember what year it was. I talked to his relative recently anyway, but it was in between all of this. He went to visit Te Kooti, and Te Kooti had a jacket, a sword, and an Enfield musket of a soldier that he'd just killed. Te Kawinga spoke to Te Kooti and his followers about the God of love and peace and the evil of killing each other. Te Kooti turned his back. Who is this man who speaks of peace and God? Te Kawinga, wearing a kiwi feather cloak and a huia feather, replied, My name is Te Kawinga, a paramount chief of Ngāti Kahanunu. I have talked with Prince Alfred, son of our queen. I come in peace. I bring a flag as a token of peace and trust from our queen. Te Kawinga continued, I come from the head of the fish where the brains are, and you are in the stomach of the fish, always growling and never happy. Take off that coat you're wearing and lay down your arms. Live with our Pākehā brothers and live in peace. I will put my kiwi cloak on you and fasten it around your shoulders and put my huia feather in your hair and make you a chief. Te Kooti did this, and Te Kawinga brought the Enfield rifle back to Wairarapa with him. Cool story, eh? Is it a cool story? Peacemaker. The guy's a peacemaker. What an effort, to go in between all of these warring tribes and to go and confront this incredibly fearsome warrior and preach the gospel of peace to him. And we know that Te Kooti later on had a revelation. And he began to speak of one who would come, who would turn the waka of Māori upright again and set it back on its course. And some people think he was talking about Taupo Te Wiremu Rātana. So he brokered a four-cornered peace agreement with Wiremu Rangitaki in Taranaki, with Te Kooti and Tawhio, the second Māori king, to say that you're not to come into my area, any area where I hold mana, including here. So he brokered a deal. And I think there's a monument on the way in here where that's as far as the hauhau came, and they stopped because of this deal. And I went today, we went and had a look at the monument that's in Queen Elizabeth Square that marks that, 1921, a monument put there by his son to honour the fact that no bloodshed had happened here during those wars. It looks pretty ratty. Somebody should, do something to make people aware of this wonderful thing. So no bloodshed there was no bloodshed, and a greenstone was divided into four to seal this arrangement. And the greenstone doorway is like a permanent arrangement. You give the greenstone and it says, you've got one, I've got one, and this creates a kind of like a metaphorical punamu tato or gateway, which says peace is made permanently. And you look around the country and you see some interesting arrangements have made between different iwi at really difficult times, either through intermarriage or the breaking up of greenstone or the sharing of greenstone as a covenant, as a promise that this peace will be made. So the first churches are Māori, massive conversion to Christ. The land wars break the connection and the trust. Māori missionaries are not supported and trained. So we've now got the bishops and whatever who are focused on the settler community, and Māori are being left to the side. They're not being given the resources. And this period results in the rise of the Māori prophetic movements to restore mana and land, and some missionaries remain committed, but there at Wairinga Ahika in Gisborne, there were 100 Māori being trained until the hauhau came through and destroyed the school, and from that point a lot of those mission stations were abandoned, and later on it was the Catholics and Mormons who picked up on Māori in those places, often because they didn't have a political agenda and decided to live with the people. So There's a legacy of pain, and Māori continued to write and humbly seek a voice, justice for land confiscation, but most of their appeals were continually dismissed. So, kind of Māori caught between worlds. And here's another hero of the faith, if you like, Wiremu te Patangaroa, Ngāti Kahungunu chief who encouraged Christianity and originally welcomed lease grazing until he saw what was happening. And his son, Pauro Patangaroa, rises to prominence after his death about 1864. He was called the Prophet Paul, or the Moses of Te Ori. And we went to Te Ori Marae there just a little bit today to have a look. In 1878, a large carved house was produced at Te Ori. But Pauro Patangaroa had an argument with the tohanga carver Te Kiri, who he was working with. And, in the construction of it, there were some strange symbols being made and a gateway created for darker spiritual forces. There's a whole lot of stuff going on here. There's an argument. This guy mocks him and says, it's going to take 8 years to complete your big meeting house. It's never going to happen. But it does open on the 5th of January after 3 years, not 8, and it's called Ngā Tau I Waru, or the 8 years, in mockery of that. But there's something going on there. And very shortly after this, Patangaroa has a bit of a revelation, and he becomes far more Christian in a Māori kind of way in his understanding. And he begins to prophesy, and he begins to make these statements that have people quite curious. He invites people. He says, and there's people from Wellington and all around the country come. There's about 2,000 people gather at Te Ori Marae because he says, I've got something to say. So they all come and they're expecting some kind of miracle or some kind of big event. But he says, well, I've had a dream. And he's starting to sound like Daniel the prophet here. He said, I had a dream. Can anybody tell me what I dreamed? No, how can we tell what you dreamed? He said, well, I saw a flag. And he describes his flag. And he's had a model of the flag made with all of these designs in it and whatever, and he puts it up and he says, well, here's the flag. Can you tell me what it means? And all of these people tried, and everybody was trying to outdo each other. And in the end he said, no, you're all wrong. And they're all looking at each other. And there's a big feast. He put on a big feast. So at the end of it, a lot of people got drunk and grumbly and whatever and went back to their way, but they missed something. There was a mystery left here. So he missed his call that something would happen, that there would be a new movement, a new church for Māori within 40 years. And they all argued about what that might be, but who can see 40 years into the future? And he died 3 months later. So it was just like, what was that all about? But the prophecy for the new church was originally claimed by the Mormons, and then the Church of Seven Rules of Jehovah, which was similar to the Anglican Church, and that's out here somewhere too, isn't it? You've got that's part of your history, and then Ratana. But here's a cool prophecy. Ruia Apirama, who's a friend of mine, translated a lot of the stuff that I wrote in the Ratana book, sent me this version of the time is coming unfolding when there will rise among you children, fair-skinned with 2 languages, who will hear the wailing of their ancestors and will be moved by the songs and hymns of their mothers, where justice shall descend from heaven and truth shall rise from the land, where both shall embrace with a holy kiss. 18th of March 1881, that's the same day he's talking about the flag. And he also made other prophecies and made those available. So now, I just want to make sure I'm not missing out here, and I don't want to. So, restoring Māori vision. Well, I told you about Ratana and his Holy Spirit visitation on the 8th of November 1918. He was standing on the deck of his house, and a cloud came toward him, and ultimately there was a calling to turn Māori from the fears and superstitions of the past, from the old gods and that, to unite Māori under Ihoa o Numano, Jehovah of the multitudes. And this was his calling between the 2 world wars. And he also, one of the other things he did was he gathered the words of the Maori prophets and brought them together and said, here they are in my hands. And I thought, well, that's a bit cheeky, isn't it? But they'd been forgotten. So much gets forgotten, and he was bringing it together. And he said, "Remember what all the old prophets said." He was restoring hope for Maori and saying, one is coming with the Bible in one hand and the Treaty of Waitangi in another. And there'd been so many of those kinds of prophecies, and most of those prophets had talked about restoration of a spiritual and political identity. And Taiawhio Te Tau, who was the first bishop of the Seven Rules Church, who established that monument in the QE2 Park, was fascinated with Patangaroa's prophecies. And he would study them deeply. But these guys, these prophets, they also had newspapers. There were 3 Maori newspapers here informing everybody. There was a whole incredibly informed network at the same time. So this monument is about goodwill, peace between Wairarapa Māori and Pākehā, the fact that there's no bloodshed here. It's also the 40th anniversary of Patangaroa's prophecies that was put up to mark. Many moved to the Ratana Church, and Te Tau became an apostle. And he wanted to ensure that Patangaroa's prophecies were included among those that Ratana was protecting. So I thought my friend Richard Te Tau might come tonight, but that's Richard and Owen Pumana, and Richard is a direct descendant. And if you know about Owen Pumana, he's an amazing man on his own. He's looking after homeless people around the country. So 47 years after Patangaroa's prophecy, Ratana receives a petition with 500 names on it from Te Ori Marae saying actually something wrong is happening out here. We've tried to have various tohanga come and pray over this place and excise it or whatever, but there's a curse over Te Ori meeting house that Patangaroa had built, and so Ratana made sure that he had the permission of the people, and he came with 144 of his own followers, and he waited around for a day just to get the feel of it, and in the end he went inside, and there was a big marble monument sitting on the floor inside the meeting house, and he asked the people to take that outside, and then he got a jemmy and they lifted up the floorboards, and under the floorboards there were a number of things, including a big glass bottle with skeletons in it and all sorts of weird stuff, and there was a 100-pound slab of greenstone that was considered to be a Maori stone. In other words, it's a gateway between the spiritual realm and this realm. And when the people watched him get down there, they said it was almost like the place suddenly became covered in spiders. There were all these spiders all over him. And he pulled the stone out and he took it outside, and he slept for 3 or 4 days after that. He said it was the strongest curse that he'd ever come across in the country, but he lifted it, and that monument outside Te Ori Marae, there it is there. He said it was one of the most powerful curses in the country, and he also made a lot of statements too. He said, "I've come here to unite the fish." And the fish Te Ika Amaui, he said, all the tribes are represented here. I've come here for unity. I've come to try and bring things together after this brokenness, because this represents the things of the past. And he challenged those who twisted or dismissed the truths of Jehovah and the Bible, because there were a lot of people making up all sorts of stuff. And he said, all you intellectuals, now you need to come together in one waka so that we can paddle together in unity for Māori recovery. So to me, that's an extraordinary thing. Here's from the Treaty of Waitangi. Paul Goldsmith, he was a politician for a while, wasn't he? He did a bit of treaty work, and this was his conclusion. Wairarapa Māori from all iwi were, by the end of the 1800s, virtually landless, with social and economic marginalisation on a scale compared to, if not more severe, than some of those areas affected by confiscation. 1924, Ratana and Tupu Tainga Kawa Te Waharoa. There's another golden thread. Tupu is the son of Tamihana Te Waharoa, the kingmaker. The Bible that the kingmaker uses to coronate the Māori king or queen is the same Bible today that Tamihana used back in that day, and he used scriptures to defend the kingitanga movement and the creation of it, saying, you have a queen for you, we want a king for us. I'm following King David's example, and it was full of instructions. And on his deathbed, Tamihana had 2 sons, and he said, who's going to follow me? He had the Bible. He predicted his own time of death after the land wars, and one of his sons said, I'm going to get Pākehā back for what they've done to you. All your land's been confiscated. I'm angry. And the other son said, no, I'll follow in your footsteps. I'll be a peacemaker. So this is Tupu Tainga Kawati Waharoa, who went to England and with one of the Maori kings to take a petition to say, give the land back. That was during the First World War. He was rejected because of a lot of stuff going on. He was told, go back to the New Zealand government. He joined up with Ratana after having seen the miracles at Ratana Pa and went with him in 1924 to take a petition of 2/3 of all Māori saying, please honour the treaty. And here's all the evidence of what's been taken. So it was really Ratana that brought the treaty back into prominence. And it took until 1932 when Eruera Tirakatani, the father of Whetu Tirakatani Sullivan, who was a Ratana independent MP, who tabled that petition in Parliament that was put together by him and Tupu with these words, to be tabled as part of the laws of the country to preserve the ties of brotherhood between Pākehā and Māori for all time. That's the petition there. It took 7 books in all, 40,000 signatures, but it was 14 years before it was reported back on. So all these attempts by Māori to do the right thing. So one of the things that Ratana said is, here in my right hand I hold a Bible, and here in my left hand is Treaty of Waitangi. I say, first of all, let us one and all unite under Ihoa and the Bible, and after this we will take hold of the treaty. He said that in 1921, nearly 100 years ago. As my old dad used to say, there's too many people wandering around today with the treaty in one hand and nothing in the other. And I wonder whether we've probably done our time. It's 9:10, but you know, the flagpole of recognition, the Honi Hiki hacked it down a few times and it was ignored. What he was trying to say, he just wanted the governor's attention. That was replaced by Mahi Kawati, who was the son of Te Ruki, or the Duke Kawati, who was a friend of Honi Hiki, and it was replaced with the Peace and Reconciliation flagpole. Whakakotahitanga o ngā iwi I rua, the coming together of two peoples, all the way through Māori deputations, delegations, petitions, keep saying we want a way for our two peoples to come together so that we can live in peace. And so often this has just been ignored. Governor Gore Brown refused to come along to the original opening of that flagpole or replacing of it, and Dame Patsy Reedy, our Governor General, did it in 2018 with a strong sense of unfinished business. She said, better late than never. My wonderful wife's artwork there. This is what we're called to, the ministry of reconciliation. Now, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. God reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. Any questions? Love to hear your thoughts. I know I've probably taken up a good part of your night, but hey, you could have been at the movies and come out at the other end of it and go, that was a 2-star movie. Have you done that? Yep. Oh, what a waste of $15. Just stayed home and watched The Chosen on Netflix. Oh, well, God bless you. You've been very patient. You may.
The Ho-Ho uprising.
Yep.
Derek, I'll be some light for the people on the street.
So the Ho-Ho uprising, where did it start? Where did it get to? And how did it end? Just briefly, if you can.
Te Ua Haumene, the Windman, was a Methodist Māori teacher, and he was under Riemenschneider over in Taranaki. He was a good teacher, and after the land wars I mean, a lot of Māori just lost all the promises of the treaty, all the promises that the missionaries had made of, becoming recognised as a Māori teacher. So many, when the bishops came, they refused to recognise a lot of these Māori teachers who had given so much to minister to their own people, and, made them jump through hoops like learn Latin or learn Greek, or for goodness sake, these guys are doing amazing work. It's just a travesty, really. So, Te Ua Haumini, after much, it's a complex story, but he got sick, he had a feverish dream, pretty much similar to what Te Kōti had, and believed that he was called to, if the missionaries weren't there so part of the problem was that Kawanata Te Whito, the Old Testament, came in just as the land wars were starting to take shape. But the missionaries were told to get out of the way. So you've now gone from the New Testament, where Māori are getting the revelation of Jesus Christ, to an Old Testament that talks about the loss of land and the promised land. So the Māori prophetic movement picked this up, and they started to see our land has been stolen, so we want our land back, just like the Israelites did. So they took this to heart. And initially it was pai mariri, peace and righteousness, with some interwoven bits and pieces of old Māori religion. But some of those people had been so hurt and had lost so much that it became quite ritualised and quite angry. And it was meant to be a movement around the country. One lot would go one way, the other lot would go the other way, and they would meet in Gisborne and kick out all the Pākehā. So it got out of hand, it got angry, and you lost the guy over at Opotiki who got hung on a tree, Vokna, one eye is the government, one, but that's what happened. And Tika Winga, who I talked about, actually became the baptizer for Te Ua Haumini when it was still on track, and tried to be a peacemaker in that movement. And he was called the baptizer because he was preaching the gospel. And Te Ua said to him, the water is in you, you be the baptizer. But then he stepped away and tried to broker peace when it started to get militant and angry.
Is it not true that, particularly the how thing was a reaction to some terrible things that happened in the Waikato land?
Yep.
That really fired up.
Well, that's right. Well, the guy, yeah, that's right. The guy who was key to provoking some of that violence had lost his wife and two daughters in a wharikarakia in Waikato, where the Māori were told this was a safe place, and it got burned with people inside of it, and he was inconsolable, and he just could not be pulled back from that. So, yeah, heavy stuff. Is that?
From our Western sort of conception of land ownership, and we try and go back 150, 170 years and try and understand it, with the land in those days, there might have been multiple ownerships or no ownership at all. Like you might have had, like Waitara for instance, the Waikato people came over, they chased all the people from Taranaki away from there. So those people from Taranaki went to Otaki. There were some survivors that sort of hid in the bush. And you had the conquerors from Waikato who didn't even want to live there, so they went back to Waikato. So then you had three groups of people that all had claim on that bit of land. So how would that, was it ever going to be a peaceful solution? Who sells it?
I think Waikato conceded and left it to the original owners, because there's about three waves of violent interaction between the different tribes there. But yeah, customary ownership, Kingi to Rangataki was one of the primary customary owners as chief of that area, so McLean had to deal with him, but he decided to deal with an individual. And in dealing with that individual who sold the land for $200, Kingi was saying, you cannot sell the blanket. The blanket is not mine to sell. It belongs to future generations. You cannot do this. And that was where Hadfield got involved, because, and even Māori in Hawke's Bay, who were Christians, were going, if one part of the body hurts, we all hurt. We can see this is coming. So William Williams' son, Henry's son, he's writing, they're all writing to the government and saying, do you realise what you do? If you sell this land as an individual title, you're creating a precedent that Māori all over the country are watching. So he was so warned, and Hadfield wrote another one of England's little wars, pamphlets to England, just exposing what was going on with McLean and the others who were trying to acquire a rangataki's land. No, it wasn't his land, but he was the customary chief. He was the senior chief there, and he did what he could to hold on to it. But when that customary ownership was broken, yes, some Māori wanted to sell it, but he was the one who had the mana over that land. He was mana whenua. So, that was. But it's interesting. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think we've got a piece of legislation now, haven't we, that's just gone through in the past week. And part of the problem with a lot of Māori land is that the ownership has been so complicated with so many owners that they can never be tracked down. And, we've, as Pākehā, we've gone, oh, look at that land, it's all full of gorse or it's not being used or whatever. Well, the government has made it so difficult for anybody to do anything with that land. How many signatures do you need? It's like, that's the way government does things, isn't it? All we need is one person to complain, right, let's hold it up for another 3 years. Oh, no, somebody else has complained, sorry. No, they're just about dead now. So now we've got legislation that says, or is trying to say, that multiple owned Māori land can be used more fruitfully for the benefit of the iwi or the majority owners. So there's been an important shift there, I think. A lot, Māori have had their hands tied around what they can do with a lot of the huge resources that they still, or what resources they do have here. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I call that the wound on the side of the nation. That's where our land wars began. That's where Parihaka became the place of refuge for the people from the land wars who still tried to model, peaceful Hiruharamahu, the New Jerusalem. They tried to model what that looked like, as did Ratana, etc. But that's where the mamae is. That's a real, you've got street names there that are named after the gold and all those guys that invaded that place, even though the treaty, the settlement has clearly stated that it was an illegal invasion. And, so how do Māori feel there? Why has that area just been so stricken with poverty? And it has to be resolved, but they have to figure out how to resolve that within their own rohi. But it's one of the last. Until that's resolved, I don't think we can move on. And of course, in Ngāi Tahu in Auckland, there's still a huge treaty settlement to be resolved. And I don't know where this all goes, but I know that they've said, Ngāpui, sorry, if they said we're not going to settle without a drama. So we go back to what the treaty was like on that day as a drama played out, so that everybody around the country knows what played out and what is resolved, and not accepting sovereignty in the terms that some of us want, or tino rangatiratanga, or what so that's going to come to a head over the next year. So we've got a lot of, we're not there yet, but you're right, it's complex, but we need to listen and we need to hear in order to have that representation that we talked about before, so that people feel heard, so that we look under the carpet and we go, yeah. And somebody said to me, actually a couple of things, a Māori woman who's a granny now, and she's wonderful, she just started to say something on a Zoom conference, and then she's teared up and she said, why didn't they love us? Why didn't they love us? And it just resonates with me. And somebody else quoted to me something from Genesis the other day about the Abel and Cain situation. And who got killed? No, Abel or Cain, which one? Abel, of course he did. Yeah, Abel's the one that got killed, and then God says to Cain, where's your brother? He said, am I my brother's keeper? And this is a Maori man talking about how he feels his people have been treated. Are we turning our backs and going, oh, it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility, that happened way back then, it's not my ancestors? You know, how's our attitude? And I think this is our opportunity, isn't it, to have the right attitude, to build the right relationships, and to restore trust. Otherwise, it's going to get awkward, uncomfortable, and change means uncomfortable, doesn't it? Sometimes disruption happens. We're in a disruptive time. And I think what we do with that disruption, how can we be creative? We talked about the importance of creativity. How can you be creative in disruption? You know, I no longer use a typewriter for my craft. I had to move through various awkward iterations of technology. Now I wouldn't be seen dead without a word processor that just, it's magic. But I couldn't understand that in the days of the typewriter, and it seemed like, so to make that shift changed me. I could have resisted it, and I know people who resisted the march of technology and they now can't get work. So I think we're in a time like that. We don't realise, and I don't want to shift the template, but you know, about land and all the rest of it, we have to find some ground where we can operate together, because if we go, no, we can't go there, then, yeah, I don't know. I don't have the answers, but I just think we've got to keep having a conversation around this and keep looking. If God's in it, if there's a golden thread in it, let's keep looking for the golden thread. That's all I know, because if that golden thread's there, God's there, and He's going to do something, because He's in the art of healing, and He wants to use us as part of His healing team. And some of it means we've got to get out of our comfort zone and sit with people and hear their mamae, hear their stories, and go, how can we restore that trust?
I think that's a great place to leave it off. I think we could continue asking questions and hearing more about New Zealand history, but the beauty of having plenty of young people here tonight means that they also have to get to bed, so we may cut it off there. So I'd like to thank everyone who came out tonight. It's really encouraging to see how many people are interested in the topic before us, but especially I'd like to give a big round of applause to Keith Newman for all that he's done for us tonight. And so if you have any more questions, you can come up and accost him now. Otherwise, have safe travels on your way home.
Yep. And there's still some books here, and there's a bank account detail if you want to do it electronically or whatever, but thank you for being awesome.
Thank you so much. It was really good. Yeah.